Okay. So we should be live. We should be live.
Great.
Um,
I feel alive.
yeah, and you should. You should feel alive. Okay, so let's see. Are we live? Live on Facebook. So Professor Bruce Hood,
Hello, Dr. Rosenberg.
welcome to You've Got Mel. We start out
Ah,
with
no.
our jingle,
Okay.
and we always have to have the jingle, because I spent years working on it. So
Well,
what
like
what would
any
it,
opportunity for you to play
yeah,
around,
what would a program be without a jingle, right?
Indeed.
Here we go.
Get a chair, grab a seat, or we'll sweep you off your feet. We move, we groove, you got Mel. Ease your legs, rest a while, all you gotta do is smile. We're swell, can't you tell you got Mel? When the show begins, you better hold on real tight, or before you know it, you'll be high as a kite. Take a break, settle down, we're the only show in town. SRO, don't you know you got Mel? Give it up, don't think twice, we're a hurricane on ice. What the hell, give a yell, ring your bell, show and tell. Mademoiselle, give a smell, you got Mel.
You've got Mel. And Mel has the incredible Professor Bruce Hood, coming to
Hi,
us
Mel.
directly from Bristol in the UK.
That's right. Yeah, I would say lovely sunny Bristol, but in fact it's pouring with rain. So we've now entered winter. I'm afraid that's the end of our summer.
Mm-hmm. The winter of your discontent.
Oh, is it anything? I mean, goodness gracious! If it's not COVID, it's the politics. If it's not the politics, it's the planet. If it's it's like the annus horribilis or whatever they say. But it's just this terrible year we've had. It's unbelievable.
Okay, but here in my show, it's like cabaret. Everything is fine. Life is good. So Bruce, we're going to talk about your life, and perhaps happiness, superstition, religion, whatever time allows us. And we're not going to. We finished now talking about COVID and Boris Johnson.
Good.
And Donald Trump.
Oh.
And we're not going to talk about Joe Biden either. Okay, so Bruce, start at the beginning. You're Scottish and Australian, but you were born in Canada. Where in Canada?
That's right. Yeah, Toronto, Willowdale District Hospital, I think it was. Willowdale is where I was born many decades ago. I never revealed my age, but let's just say I saw the moon landings. And then my father was of Scottish descent, and we were traveling around the world. He was trying to make it in film, and he was a journalist effectively. And we ended up back in Scotland, and that's where I spent most of my sort of formative years, in Dundee, which is famous for jute, jam, and journalism, famously, and being a very miserable doer city. But I actually love Scotland. I love the Scottish people, and I miss them dearly because they're very warm and friendly, and they don't take themselves too seriously in comparison to, say, the English. Sorry, I'm having a go at my English friends here. But anyway, I went to school there, and I went to university for my first degree, and I took this topic called psychology, which I'd never heard. Oops, I haven't turned off all our alerts. This is going to be a problem. I don't know if you can hear your alerts going off on my computer, but by the way, I get lots of. Okay, I'll just be.
I hope you don't hear my alerts going off, so we're okay.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, we're right in the middle of it. We're about to hit the teaching next week, so unfortunately, I've got to be available.
We'll talk about that too.
Right. So yeah, so I took this topic called psychology, which I didn't know anything about, and I fell in love with it, and I decided I wanted to study really deep questions about the mind, consciousness, all the sorts of things which, as students, you'd sit around getting stoned and talking about these things and the deep questions of life. So I ended up then moving to Cambridge, where I did a PhD on neuroscience, and I was really interested in the developing brain. So I worked with babies, and I was interested in how vision develops, because vision undergoes a very rapid development in the first months of life. And we can understand that by understanding some of the mechanisms at the neuronal level, what's changing. So I was interested in, it sounds a little bit sort of nerdy, but I was interested in orientation processing, which is, detecting the orientation of lines. It turns out within your brain, you have specialized cells which detect orientation.
So
and
you were a biologist for a while?
No, I'd say neuroscientist. So I wasn't doing any wet physiology stuff. I was doing, I was using techniques such as evoked potentials, which are brain-related activity. You can synchronize those to a visual change in the world. And if you find the patterns are synchronized, you'll see this as a pattern of activity. So you can determine whether or not babies are seeing sorts of visual stimuli. So I worked on really kind of low-level stuff. And I loved it because it just seemed to be a real validation that even psychology can have a scientific approach, because normally psychology is dismissed as being a bit kind of woolly and, everybody knows it's common sense, but actually a lot of it is really, really fascinating stuff. Anyway, so I spent quite a while at Cambridge and then moved to America, to MIT, where I met an amazing woman Susan Carey, married to a philosopher, Ned Block, and they were studying really interesting issues about conceptual development. So how does a child start to think about the world in terms of concepts? And so it's more philosophically oriented, but I got really into that. That really opened my mind into looking at some of the bigger, deeper questions rather than focusing down on vision and orientation selectivity. So I became fascinated in the child's development, and then I spent a year and a half at the MIT, and then I applied for a job at Harvard. And I didn't think I'd even get shortlisted. I just thought, I'll apply for it and see what happens. And blow me, they offered me the job. So I moved to Harvard and found myself surrounded by really smart students, much smarter than me. So I felt like a fraud. I felt like a complete sort of, but everyone feels like a fraud. When you get to that level, the more that you know, the more that you know what you don't know. So everyone feels like a sort of.
So is imposter syndrome universal?
It's particularly strong, and I actually looked into this because I've written a textbook, best-selling textbook, by the way, in the UK, on psychology, where I talk about imposter.
You've written 3 or 4 textbooks.
Yeah, I've been busy.
Yeah.
But just to finish that point, imposter syndrome is particularly strong in academics. And anyone who actually knows what they're talking about, because the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. So I don't think there's any imposter syndrome in politicians. I don't think this is the territory. But yeah, so I spent 6 years at Harvard, 5 years, 6 years. And my wife couldn't work in the US. She was trained as a medical doctor, and she would have had to go back and retrain in order to stay in the States. So we moved back to Bristol because my wife had managed to get a senior position at Bath, and Bristol had a really good psychology department. So I became a full professor really early on in my career, so my early 30s. And that was a rather accelerated career. So I sat around for a couple of years and then got really kind of bored and realized I got to do something else. So I started writing. And that's when I started all these books that you're alluding to. And I've always loved being a kind of show-off, performer. And so combining the books.
Let's call it a communicator.
Yeah, science communication. Yeah, I ended up doing the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, which is a big thing.
Exactly, which I watched very proudly. I know that guy. Yeah.
Carl Sagan's done it. Richard Dawkins has done it. Some of the biggest names.
You were up there with the top people.
I was. So that made me feel even more of an imposter and a fraud. But anyway. So I've been writing books, and the first one, I'm sure we'll get onto them, was about the origins of supernatural thinking. And I really wrote that in response, I felt, to the critical version given by Richard Dawkins. I think Dawkins was, in his book, The God Delusion, I think he's very dismissive of religion in a very aggressive way. And I wanted to redress the balance to show that actually it's not all indoctrination, that there might actually be something in the way that we think about the world which makes religion that much more accessible and plausible for so many people. By the way, I'm not religious, but I totally understand why people are. So I wanted to kind of look at that from that perspective. Then the second book I wrote.
Bruce, let me ask you a question. While we're on your first book, you make a demarcation between superstition and religion that other people don't necessarily make.
Yeah,
I have trouble distinguishing between them. So help me, please.
Yeah,
help me for God's sake.
For God's sake. There's a lot of overlap, without a doubt, and all religions have supernatural components because they all have stories or accounts which allude to phenomena which cannot be verified by any rational evidence-based approach. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's spirits or the afterlife or whatever. Whereas supernatural beliefs don't necessarily have to involve any deity or creation story. And so I talk about these as being secular supernatural beliefs. And so we all have them, but we don't recognize them as such. And this was the point, that we have superstitions, like we have to do things otherwise in certain orders, otherwise we feel that maybe some bad fate will befall us. I'm particularly interested in essentialism, which is the belief that certain objects or things can possess a metaphysical property which makes them unique and indistinguishable, that makes them irreplaceable. So these are sentimental objects like your wedding ring. You know, if I was to offer you an identical wedding ring, people wouldn't want to exchange it because it's not the same ring. But then if you take them through a thought experiment and say, well, hold on a second, what about if we had to take your ring to the jeweler and he replaced 1 micron of gold? Would it still be the same ring? You say, people say, yes, of course, it's just still the same ring. Say, okay, so let's say you go back to the jeweler over and over and over again. Each time he replaces a micron of gold with a new bit of gold. Is it still the same ring? And people say, yeah, it must be still the same ring. And they say, well, what happens when you get to a point? You've been to the jeweler so many times, it doesn't contain any of the original gold. So it can't be the same ring. But people assume that there's a property over and beyond the material composition of anything which defines its identity. Now that's called essentialism, and it's a philosophical position. It's a wonderful kind of conundrum to play with, but I think it explains the view by many people that certain things or objects are possessed by some energy or essence which defines what they are. And that's why, for example, when I published the book, I did a press release, a press conference, and all the journalists were gathered in the conference room, and I said, and I held up this cardigan. You know what a cardigan is, a sweater sort of thing? Yeah. And I said,
Bruce, I'm Canadian. I'm Canadian by my roots.
All right.
I have to know what a cardigan is.
Cardigan is. So I said, how many of you would be willing to wear this cardigan for $10? And, you know, or $20. And they put their hands up. They say, yeah, I'd wear that cardigan. I said, how many of you would be willing to wear that cardigan if you discovered that it belonged to Jeffrey Dahmer? And of course, everyone puts their hands down. I said, well, why is it? What you think you're going to become evil just because you're touching a cardigan? And it turns out, of course, it's not Jeffrey Dahmer's cardigan at all, but the belief that it is being in contact with evil is sufficient that people feel repugnance. They don't want to come into contact with it. Now, you might say, oh, that's just association, because if you hear about Jeffrey Dahmer, you feel disgusted. And I say, okay, here's another one. Imagine you've got a cookbook, okay? And imagine that you've got another book. And one is a biography of Adolf Hitler, which is detailing all his atrocities. Would you happily hold that book? People say, yes, of course, it's a book talking about Hitler. I said, well, what about this cookbook? Would you happily hold that? They go, yeah. What have you learned that that's actually Adolf Hitler's personal cookbook? And people go, ah. Now, one has all the association of badness and evil, all the information. You can hold that, but the other one is not, it's just a cookbook. But it's because we conceive of these things as the essence transferring into physical property. So that was a theme I developed in Supersense, and there are many other examples.
Okay, but Bruce, this is something that's totally human generated.
Yes, it's part of the way that children think from a very early age.
You don't believe that there is some inherent property of this cardigan or cookbook?
No, and you go on.
Okay, so what you, yesterday we had Lior Manor, who's a famous mind illusionist. So it's very interesting that we have that you're the guest today. Do you have, as a human being, you're not religious,
No.
But do you have any superstitions? I
Oh
do.
yeah. I have rituals that I know are irrational, but they give me comfort, and they emerge partly because humans don't like the sense of having no control, and so rituals and superstitions usually they they emerge in situations where you want to try and retain some control. So, for example, sports. Many sports people have religions because, have superstitions. They're pre-match rituals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they arise because maybe, I give the example of John McEnroe. He had the famous one. Every tennis player basically has them. You'll see them all the time. The little peculiar behaviors you will notice. Some of them bounce the ball a certain number of times. These are ways of behaving which are irrational, but then they make total sense. Because if you take them away from them or you thwart the sportsman's ability to use them, then they don't perform as well. So they give you a sense of control. And that's why superstitions are associated with professions in which there's some degree of uncertainty and the consequences could be pretty negative. So you get them in soldiers, you get them in firemen. They've all got these things because they need to have this sense of order and structure that they can control. And that gives you the illusion of control. When you take control away from people, they get anxious, they get stressed. So that superstitious behavior is a perfectly natural emerging phenomenon, as is essentialism. As I said, children.
Yeah.
So in the book, it's all about the science, the cognitive mechanisms, the psychology of how these mechanisms arise in children and how they become the basis of later adult belief systems.
Okay, let's talk about kids in a minute.
Okay.
So I'll share a superstition if you share one.
Alrighty. Oh, I've got to share a superstition.
You don't have to. You can.
Oh, I'm not sure I do want to share one. One is a little bit peculiar, so I don't think I'll just leave it. Just to assure you that even someone as rational and public as myself has some deep secrets and skeletons in the closet.
Okay. So I then in absentia of you, I will. So I believe that I heard this talk at the TED, a talk at TED in Edinburgh last summer. I can't remember the name of this famous woman who had a stroke and she's a brain scientist.
Oh yeah, I know her. Yeah, I forget her name, but she's been on TED before. She's got this really. Yes.
So I should remember her name because I had coffee with her. It'll come to me the moment we end this conversation. And she argues that we have four brains. Two forebrains and two limbic brains, and each one is responsible for different behavior. And at any particular time of the day, one is more in control than the other three. And that made me feel much better because, I keep kosher even though I'm not religious. And I have this superstition where I will not stop the microwave oven when it reaches 13 seconds. I'll stop at 14 or at 12. I have no idea how that got into my brain. But I see myself as a relatively rational person, but
Yeah. Well, I don't know about being four brains, but there are various theories about the way that some information is processed so much quicker than other information. So this is sometimes called system 1, system 2. System 1 is this fast, automatic emotional system which reacts to emotions, flight or fight sort of situations. And then system 2 is more to do with reason and planning and is much slower and sluggish. And that makes a lot of kind of intuitive sense because a lot of these reactions are unconscious and they're automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because they are defense mechanisms, which you don't want to necessarily have to spend a lot of energy thinking about. They just kick in. And if a lot of the origins of these behaviors are really deeply seated in evolutionary mechanisms to try and protect us, then that's why they just happen. So face perception. Face perception is a good example. We see faces in everything, any configuration.
I just wrote about that yesterday.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's so spooky. I wandered
around there you go. Coincidence.
I wandered around my house taking pictures of weird faces, I'll send that to you.
It's called
It's not a coincidence because because I'm teaching now patterns in children's book writing.
Okay.
So we're going to go on. We're going to go to children now.
Well, let me just finish with faces. It's called pareidolia. It's a well-studied phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's understood entirely in terms of the advantages of detecting faces amongst random stimuli, because that is a better bias to have than not seeing the faces. Okay. So this has been studied mathematically, and we actually know where in the brain this is happening. So it's totally plausible in terms of the neuroscience and why it evolved. Anyway, let's talk about kids.
As a biologist, I couldn't agree more. You know, anything that has a little dot that could be an eye suddenly becomes a face and a creature.
Yeah, and also we anthropomorphize. So we think about other things as being human-like, and we interact even with inanimate objects. We give them intentional states. So we talk about them as being, you know, purposeful, and that makes it much easier to interact with things with your car or your computer when you talk to it. So I mean, there's lots and lots of ways in which these biases manifest in rather loopy behavior, but they make total sense.
Okay.
Anyway,
one of the ways to reconcile this, because I agree with you, is to write children's books. You see, then it's all kosher.
Yeah. Are you just going to go to a break? So something has just popped up. I'm just going to check this. It might be quite important, Mel. So I hope you don't mind.
Okay. Do you want me to sing a song meanwhile?
I'll just be okay. Okay. Sorry.
It's somebody who's watching you. That's all.
Yeah. Someone's watching on Facebook and just wanted to say, "Hey, you're a Mel show" or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. So Bruce, the good thing about you is that we could talk for hours. You see, so I'm trying with my ADHD lizard brain or whatever to have some kind of semi-continuity while we keep getting off track. So you've done research on children.
Yeah.
And because I am a child at heart, and so are you, and I write the children's stories and you do research, let's talk about kids a bit.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you a specific question. You know, I teach, when I teach entrepreneurs and writers, I say, you have to connect with the child in you. Do we have children in us?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's part of the reason I was so fascinated in developmental psychology, because I don't know, the child is the origin of the man, or I mean, that's a kind of, I think I've stolen that from, can't remember which sect of Christianity. So give me a child to 7, I'll show you the man, sort of thing. I think that's a badly mangled version of the quote, but it's true in the sense that you can understand adult behavior by looking at child development and the impact of the environment, how that shapes us as adults, and it leaves a legacy. And even though we think we can rationalize all these things and control them with logic and experiences later on, it never entirely goes away. And actually that's actually a principle, I think, of the central nervous system, that nothing is lost. Everything, even reflexes, and you know about reflexes. Well, you know, reflexes, that babies born with reflexes, and a lot of these disappear, but they never entirely go away. They don't really disappear. They become suppressed or integrated. So that's why when someone goes into a coma, for example, you get the reemergence of all these infantile reflexes. They've never gone away. So if that's a principle of something as basic as a motor response, it's true of memories. Memories are always integrated. Everything, every experience is stored away in some form or other. It's never entirely lost. So that's one of the reasons I think developmental psychology is so important, because you can see the origins of later adult thinking and behavior by looking at kids, which is what we were saying on the, a moment ago about superstition.
Okay, I've been waiting years to ask you this question. Okay, so okay. I'm a 5-year-old. If there's a child within me, my 5-year-old, this is the child within Mel. So I write children's stories for 5-year-olds, which is essentially I write them for myself. How old is the child within you? Are we all 5-year-old, or some people are 6-year-old children and some people are 3-year-old children?
Yeah, good point. I don't know the answer to that question, but I would have thought that my sense of identity, in the sense of when I can think back to when I really started to think, to recall having Bruce being Bruce, was probably around about 8 years of age, so quite late. But that also then fits with a lot of research which suggests that 7 years, 6 to 7 years of age is a major transition point. This is, and I've done work on this demonstrating that the sense of identity changes very significantly over that period of time. For example, children's sense of morality changes, so they become much more other focused, much more aware of the consequences of their actions. I mean, there's examples in much younger children, 3 and 4 and so on, but this kind of ability to kind of see yourself as an independent person, I think, really, I would imagine from 7 to 8 years onwards. And so that's probably why I feel that's the case. Now, I might just be post-rationalizing that and using all my experience to say, it
would be interesting if everybody had the child within them that at a different stage of development.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you another thing which is very interesting, which is called infantile amnesia. Very few people, in fact, unless they're making it up, no one can remember what it's like to be 2 years of age. They've got no self-concept, really. I mean, they might have some fleeting impression of maybe, some sensory memory of maybe a party or something, but there's no detailed memories. There's no autobiographical memory, as we say in the field, below 2 years of age. And that's called infantile amnesia. And one of the reasons is it's partly to do with brain maturation, but it's also to do with the sense that child doesn't see themselves as independent to the world. Everything is just an extension of the self. So they don't have a self-concept. And that doesn't really start to begin until around the second birthday. And
so they're not seeing the world. They're just part of the shit that's happening.
Exactly. So they don't see themselves independent to the world. So they don't, and that's why they can't conceive of memories in that sense. Because if you think about memories, they generally have a protagonist, you, and everything is revolving around them. So it's an interesting view on how memories are formed, and one of the reasons that's why memories are limited from 2 years onwards, as it were. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of truth to that. I think memories they come in different forms. Where some memories are very episodic, so that you have really detailed ones. Those are typically very emotionally charged memories. So remembering, saying 9/11, most people have a very vivid memory of exactly that event because it was so emotionally charged. Your memory systems really enhance that. But most memory is just a story. And that story changes with retelling. So we often confuse memories, we often conflate them, and we invent them. And that's one of the wonders of memory, is that it just seems to be this completely, active system all the time. Anyway, I've gone off into memory, but you were telling us about writing stories for 5-year-old Mel.
No. This is about you, Bruce. This is me listening to you and asking questions. So, I want to talk about happiness. What is your second book about?
Oh, the second book was called The Self-Illusion. And I could not get that book published for the life of me. And it's ended up being a bestseller. And I think that speaks volumes about the problem of publishing. As you're aware, the publishing world is very risk averse, and it tends to go for formulas. And they try to second guess the audience's what they think the audience wants. And that's why we've seen a stagnation, I think, in writing. I think it's, as in music, as in many of the creative.
How did you get it published in the end?
Well, I think in the end it went to Oxford University. Oh, I know why. Because it was actually published in the UK by the publisher that had published the first book, and the editor there had loved. I'd said something. I'd made a comment in the Supersense in my first book, and I said, the thing about consciousness is there can't be a little you inside your head. There's no little King Solomon sitting there weighing up decisions, because if there was a little King Solomon in your head, then who's in his head? And he's not flipping a coin. So I started to talk about the problem of there being a self, because most people conceive of the self as a little version of themselves sitting inside their heads, controlling their body like a sophisticated puppet master. And I said, that's illogical. The self is actually produced by the brain out of a multitude of parallel systems, and it creates this self because that's the only way to make sense of all the information. But don't be confused into thinking that that self exists independently of all the parallel information. Now, for most people, that's mind-blowing. And that really blew the editor's mind. He said, that's very intriguing. So I put this proposal saying there's no self. And of course, all the American publishers threw their hands up and said, that's terrible, don't like the idea. It's a very individualistic nation, America. So they did not want to have anything which challenges individualism. But as I say, you know, that book, it was picked up by OUP, Oxford University Press in America, even though they're based in England, but they have a division in America, and they published it. And I didn't get much of an advance for it, but it ended up being a bestseller. So I was really pleased by that, because it validated my opinion that not to listen to publishers or people who are the experts in this case, because you can't really predict what's going to work. Then I gave the Christmas lectures, and then I got lots of offers to write books. But Penguin came to me because they were relaunching the Pelican series, which I don't know if you remember that now, but that was a series of books. Yeah, they were very kind of condensed, you know, very iconic books.
Bruce, I have a publishing house that publishes anything. So if everybody says no to you, I'll say yes. I'm telling you right now.
That's true. Although actually, after my last experience, which I'll tell you about in a moment, I'm not so sure I'm going to go back into writing all too quickly, as I feel the way the world is going now is that it's all moving to digital formats. And I kind of have been resisting that, but I think this current situation has just made me realize that this is the future.
My publishing house is all electronic.
Yeah.
We have 140,000 books, and you're more than welcome.
I think the written word, there will always be a place for it. So that's never going to go away. And I think actually what we saw over the past 5 years was a resurgence of interest in public, you know, physical books.
Okay, so tell me about your book with Penguin Pelican.
That was called The Domesticated Brain. And by coincidence, I just read a paper in Nature published by our Kinternet. Well, it wasn't published by our Kinternet friend, but he posted it on he has a site called The Human Beast. His name is Tanas. And I don't know if he's going to be tuning into this. But anyway, he linked to this Nature paper showing this link between testosterone in males and these hunter-gatherers and their socialization. And that was really interesting, because in my third book, I called it The Domesticated Brain. I had a theory that humans went through another major evolution since the last ice age. Their brains actually literally shrank by about 20%, 15%, which is actually a significant reduction in brain size, because the brain has been getting larger and larger and larger over the thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And so why would it suddenly start shrinking? And that struck me as a really interesting anomaly, until you discover that testosterone its metabolic qualities leads to expansions. And so what I think was happening, that there was a reduction in testosterone, and that may have explained the shrinkage of the brain. Now, you might say that's the wackiest thing I've ever heard. But it turns out that Dmitry Belyaev, who was a Russian geneticist in the 1940s, he demonstrated that if you take a species that has never been domesticated, like the Russian fox, and you select them for the most sociable pairs, you keep crossbreeding them. So you just choose the foxes that are the least aggressive, you'll end up with a domesticated fox, and it looks no different to a dog. It just looks like a dog. It's got floppy ears. Its behavior is totally passive and placid. It's very cooperative. And guess what? Its brain shrinks by about 15%. And it turns out every domesticated animal, you goes through the same phylogenetic it goes through the same biological process.
You know, Bruce, sorry. This happens in bacteria also.
Really? Okay.
Yes. For example,
so
if you take the whooping cough, Bordetella pertussis, right?
Yeah.
When you take it from a sick individual, the bacteria are very clumpy, and then they start to lose virulent genes, and the DNA becomes shorter, and they become more docile as you transfer them in the laboratory.
That's great. Well, I mean, this would have had to happen if you had civilization. When we moved from hunter-gatherers, now having warriors would have been really good. I'm not suggesting there's no warriors, of course, because nations become, they become aggressive. But for most of the time, if you're living in a cooperative, emerging agrarian society, an agricultural society, a farming community, you can't be at war all the time. You need to have some degree of cooperation. You need to have some rules, and you can't be rule breakers. Which brings me to my final book, which was published last year, called Possessed. And that book is all about the origins of ownership. Because ownership is, when you think about it, we don't think about it that much, and I wish we would, because I think it's a fascinating topic. How do you learn about ownership? How does a child understand ownership? What is ownership? And why did it emerge? And it's actually a very interesting thing, because it turns out that ownership is entirely a concept, and it's defined in different ways, and that's why we have lawyers. If ownership was understood by everyone, we wouldn't need the lawyers. But the lawyers are there to kind of argue about who owns anything, because ultimately, take, for example, land. Who owns the land? Well, you might say, well, I own the land. I've got a deed of preference. Well, who had it before you? And by the way, what allowed your ancestors to sort of take claim on ownership over? So there are lots of historical reasons why ownership is complex. And then you've got shared ownership. There's many issues about it, but one of the things I point out is that it must have emerged as part of the process of civilization, that we started to accumulate resources, and we had to put into place mechanisms to prevent people just sort of helping themselves in the way that animals normally do. Animals don't have a concept of ownership. They have a concept of possession, and they'll fight over territory. But this notion that you can kind of leave your possessions and go away and someone will look after it for you because you have the convention of law and ownership, that is really, when you think about it, really kind of interesting, because that would have been a powerful mechanism, first of all, for enabling us to build societies, but then the transference of wealth. So then we could then sort of, we could have all that sort of mechanism. So it's a wonder, and then I play with it in a number of ways. There's some great, I got a great example, kicks the book off, about these guys. I don't know if I got time to tell you, but anyway, this secondhand dealer goes to an auction and he buys this grill, for barbecuing. He buys for a couple of dollars, and he takes it home, and he opens it up and there's a human foot in it. And so he calls the police, and the police take it away because they don't know whether it's a murder or somebody's been digging up graves. And then the guy the dealer says, actually, you know what? I'd like that foot back, because I can maybe make some money showing it off as some sort of freak show thing. And it turns out the foot comes from someone who's still alive, who had undergone an operation, and for some bizarre reason wanted his foot. So he kept his foot, and then he decided to put it into a grill and put it into storage, and then he moved away. And when he didn't keep up with the payments, they sold off all the contents of the storage. So this guy got this grill, and he came into possession of his foot. But who owns the foot? See, one guy had paid for it, and the other guy had kind of let. So you see that there are interesting, and in fact, that was a really interesting situation where they both ended up in court arguing about who owns the foot.
This is a true story. This is a true story.
Yeah, it's actually in the film. There's a documentary made about it, which is, I can highly recommend it, called Finders Keepers.
So Bruce, we have a few more minutes, and you've confused me, which is a good thing. I love when you confuse me. We haven't had such a wonderful talk in years, and I'm so happy we.
And I haven't even gone to happiness yet.
I know we'll have time. We have till next week when we start teaching. Okay, but a child. By the way, your thing about ownership reminds me of Yuval Noah Harari. The moment that you invoke a story, you say, "Hey, by the way, I'm Jewish. I'm going away for 2,000 years, but this land is mine when I come back." So like, that's a very personal take on what you're saying. But what I wanted to ask you is, 1-year-old kids are playing with a doll or a block, and you take that block away from them, they start crying. Yeah. So 1-year-olds do have a sense of ownership, but they don't have a sense of self, according to what you told me 20 minutes ago.
They have a sense of possession. Ownership is different from possession. For ownership to be different,
possession, but not ownership. But they don't have a sense of self, so how can they possess something?
Well, they can know that their sense of self is that everything belongs to them. For an infant, Piaget, the great Swiss philosopher, argued that the baby thinks everything belongs to them because that's the way they're treated. They don't see the world as different. The world is just an extension of their systems. Everything is theirs to play with. It's only when their parents start to say, "No, you got to put that down. That doesn't belong to you. Okay, that's not yours." So our sense of self is actually constructed by the things that we can claim ownership over, which is why kids fight over stuff all the time. They fight over stuff even though they don't want it. They know that. This is why I get fights breaking out in playgrounds. Over 90% of the fights in the playground are over possessions. And they go after them because they realize that once they have them, they're top dog. And this is how they establish their dominance, through what they can claim possession over. And therefore, they're violating ownership. See, ownership requires you to understand that there are consequences for taking it away. And also, you have to police other people's possessions as well. You can't just stand by and let someone take things, because you have to tell the police or the authorities, or protect their authority, protect their possessions. Now, you don't see that in the animal kingdom. You might see that maybe in corvids, who are very, very clever animals. These are the crows. But generally, animals just fight over possessions. It's the dominant one that gets it, irrespective. Now, if they appreciated ownership, they wouldn't fight over possession. So there's a difference between possession and ownership. But you are right in saying that there's a link between ownership and the sense of self.
Okay, so happiness.
Happiness, absence of stress. People have asked me, how do you define happiness? And it's actually not an easy concept, because it means different things to different people. But I'm increasingly coming around to that actually it's the absence of things which make you happy. So it's an interesting take, because everyone says, oh, happiness is something you should acquire. I'm thinking, no, actually, it's getting rid of all the other stuff will make you happy. It's all the other burdens that fall upon you which make you unhappy. So I think it's a state of absence rather than a state of possession, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I've been teaching this course.
It makes a lot of sense. I interviewed a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist, and he will tell you that it's just biochemistry. That it's, dopamine levels and dopamine receptors. Sure.
But that, again, it's not a contradiction. It can fit in with, if you think about it, anxiety or stress, okay, that mobilizes the body. There's a release of various hormones and neurotransmitters in the brain, mobilizing your body. Yes, happiness registers in the pleasure centers of the brain. By the way, I'm increasingly becoming more skeptical about the localization of a lot of these things. I think a lot of neuroscientists are now starting to realize the system's far more complicated and integrated than just, say, the release of dopamine. The release of dopamine has become almost a euphemism for happiness. Everyone uses, in fact, you hear everyone talking about, oh, that's triggering my dopamine. And that just makes it too reductionist and too simplistic. So I think we've lost a little bit by always explaining things at the molecular level. I think that loses some of its value as an explanatory mechanism.
Part of the intricacy is that we have a lot of different kinds of dopamine receptors. It's not just the dopamine. Yes. It's how the receptors are activated by them.
But just returning to your point about it, so your psychiatrist friend said, oh, it's dopamine, but happiness is also contentment. And that's not necessarily the same system which is associated with elation or mood change. And some people would argue, actually, this obsession with kind of feeling good, the dopamine thing, is only a small part of it. And actually, that's an idea that has been around for a long, long time. Aristotle made this distinction as well. So it was hedonism was Strippus, was another Greek philosopher. He talked about hedonism as being the avoidance of pain. So that gets back to what I was saying earlier, the avoidance of unpleasant things and the pursuit of pleasurable things. And Aristotle said, no, that's the wrong way to go about it. You're too self-focused, You've got to realize that happiness comes from making other people happy, from a flourishing life, from putting your effort into enriching the lives of others. You, in turn, will become a happier person. And I think that's a better way of looking at it, because I think if you obsess about your own self-happiness, then you've got the wrong comparison. You've got the wrong focus, and that I think
it's all about contentment in the end.
Yes. I think contentment is probably the best way to go about it. If you imagine a society of hedonists, that would not be a very good society, because everyone's trying to maximize their pleasure. That might actually come at the consequences of other people. Whereas a contentment, I presume, is a more other-focused way of living a life, which is much more conducive to us as a social animal.
It's almost rank capitalism, as opposed to I won't say socialism, but social living.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of criticism in that book, Possessed, when I was talking about, because I talk about possessions as being the root of unhappiness. We pursue possessions more and more, and then we get bored with them. We don't realize we adapt to everything quickly. And so we've got into a situation of individualism where we're trying to get higher and higher and higher up the social scale by owning more and more stuff. And that has consequences for us as individuals, but consequences for the planet. And I've made an argument that unrelenting consumerism, capitalism, is ultimately self-destructive. And so there's no way of avoiding that. There's no way. And I got attacked for that, saying, "Well, that's too political. You can't say that." But it's true. And I think this whole situation, I know we're not supposed to go back to pandemics, but I think a lot of people are waking up, because I think we've been fast forwarded in a situation to see the consequences of the way that there's a domino effect in all of our systems, which are vulnerable. No, I don't think, I haven't got a solution. I haven't got an answer. And I certainly don't think, communism is the way to go about it. But I think we can certainly reassess why we make the choices that we do, because the choices that we make are in the pursuit of happiness. If you think about it, no one makes the choice to be unhappy. The job you go for, the relationship you go for, the meal you go for, everything does this because they're predicting this is going to make me happy. But in reality, it never really delivers the anticipated value that you think you're going to get. And so I think we've got to wake up to that. People say, "Oh, I've got to get more." And what they don't realize is this thing we call the hedonic.
But Bruce, if you were asking Yuval Noah Harari, he would say maybe that this depends on the story that your social system tells itself. So if you are in a capitalist society, then your mantra, your story, is going up on the ladder we talked about by having more and more possessions. But I know from my past, when I was a socialist and when I was doing things for other people, more than I am today, perhaps, I was very happy about it in a structure that gave value. This is really interesting, Bruce. This is interesting. We'll talk about this sometime off camera, but this is your show, not mine. But you've given me a ton of thought here.
Well, this is I just on that last point. This is part of the book is actually the difference between societies. The happiest societies are the Nordic societies. Okay, Norway, Denmark, and Norway, because of their socialist. Well, they're not entirely socialist, but their difference between, for example, the U.S., which has a very individualistic, capitalistic, hierarchical structure. But all societies have different dimensions to that, and it fits what you were just saying. It's the story, because what we do is we pursue what we believe we should be doing, because that's what we're told to do. So in the Far Eastern culture, it's if you try to stand out, that's considered as rude. You're supposed to be part of the group, and we have the opposite story in the US. But anyway, so yes, you're conforming with the expectations, and that's something children learn from an early age. So this is the point. This is what they're taught to believe. This is what they're told is the recipe for success and happiness. First, be successful, then you'll be happy. It's the other way around.
Absolutely.
Be happy first, and then you'll become successful.
Okay, we have just a couple more minutes. So, as a university professor, do you think that we're going to go back to the old teaching, or is this the opportunity for the world to teach our students differently? 2 minutes.
Well, as you know,
like Joe Biden.
All right, 2 minutes. All right, 2 minutes. Well, I think that we can't go back to the old ways. I think there's going to be a real shake-up of the whole institution of higher education and the finance which supports it. And a lot of the problems in the UK we're seeing are the consequences of imposing market forces on something which should be freely available to everyone. And we've got ourselves tied in knots. And we're forcing people to do dangerous things because of the economic situation. On the other hand, I'm an optimist, and I see that this new technology can open up so much more potential. But I do think we need to reevaluate the goals and the stories that we tell our kids about what success is, because we've got it wrong.
Okay. And finally, the most important question of all, the Beatles. Are you a Beatles fan?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Love the Beatles.
What's your favorite Beatles song, Bruce? I don't even know.
Hey Jude.
Really?
Just because, I just love going in on the chorus. I sing off key. Well, I'm actually not a bad singer, but I love Hey Jude.
So now you're precipitating my final request, which is, would you mind singing a little bit of the chorus for our spectators?
Oh, the chorus is the hard bit, because that's the na 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 na. It's the verse.
Bruce, go for it. Go. We've been in your comfort zone the whole interview. Give us a few words.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take a sad song. Anyway, that's the verse rather than the chorus.
Professor Bruce Wood, I'm going to ask to speak to you offline next week, because this was incredible. I want to talk to you about the future of academia.
Yeah. Hey, Mel, next week is my next week. The term starts. It's going to be hell. But anyway, I'm sure we can.
Bruce, it was the metaphoric next week. It could be 2 months.
Okay, good. All right, lovely to speak to you, Mel.
Time isn't working these days. Thank you very much, Professor Bruce Hood. This was incredible. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.